Hello, welcome to today's webinar and Happy New Year. I'm Laura Kushner-Key, Executive Editor of Understood.org. And today's webinar will hopefully be a breath of fresh air for parents who are trying to help their kids access accommodations on standardized tests, but they're not quite sure how to make it happen. Our guest today comes from the College Board. His name is Stephen Pereira. Stephen is the Executive Director of Services for Students with Disabilities. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. I hope today that we'll be able to examine the relationship of accommodations to standardized tests, talk about how to access them efficiently, and to better assess how and what accommodations a student might need on those tests, and then go into a bit about how to request them and how to support those requests. We'll be using the College Board's process as an example, but hopefully a lot of what we're talking about will be universally adaptable to any test that a student might be taking, especially those nationally and globally standardized tests, such as the ones at the College Board, the SAT, AP, PSAT/NMS-QT that we offer. I guess the best way to start is let's talk about what the real purpose of the accommodation is. We're all used to students getting accommodations in their school, and we can move on to the next slide. And in a classroom setting, the purpose of an accommodation is to assist a student to meet their learning goals and the other goals of their IEP, their 504 plan, their formalized plan. But things change a little when you're talking about what happens on a test. With respect to testing, we're really talking about ensuring that a student's aptitude and achievement is measured accurately. And in the classroom test, that can have a wide variety of meanings. We can talk about anything from just adapting the student's experience while taking the test, giving them extra time, giving them breaks, giving them the assistive technology necessary to take the test, to adapting the test to ensure that what you're testing is the student's abilities and knowledge and not their disability. When you get to a standardized test, however, things become a little more restricted because we're talking about a nationally standardized test, and we're really looking at ensuring with an accommodation that the student has the opportunity to accurately demonstrate their knowledge, their ability, rather than their disability, but on that exam in question. And to ensure that the test is standardized, that the score is valid, you can't change a test so significantly that it alters the test construct and the validity of that score at the end. So
Stephen, do you think, would you mind giving our users a little bit of a rundown of what are examples of some of the standardized tests that the College Board helps parents get accommodations for?
Certainly. The College Board creates and administers a number of tests. Tests such as the SAT, the PSAT, NMS-QT, the AP exams, CLEP exams, AccuPlacer exams, which are used at the post-secondary level to assess skills and needs, and a number of other assessments. And similar tests are given across the country at various levels, whether it's other tests given at the high school level or at the post-secondary level, graduate admissions exams, and of course standardized tests for licensing and certification, all which fall under that general category that we'll be talking about.
Great, thank you for clarifying that.
Now, using the College Board as an example, and perhaps we should give you a little background on the College Board. The College Board has been around for over 100 years and has been providing accommodations on its standardized tests for over 75 of those years. That's about 34 years before the federal government required us to. At the College Board, those are handled by the Office for Services to Students with Disabilities, and we expect to get over 100,000 requests in just this given school year for accommodations. In the end, more than 75 different types of accommodations are granted each year. The list is endless and changes every year depending on the needs of the students asking for them. Um, SSD, Services for Students with Disabilities, provides accommodations to students with documented disabilities. The requests and the approvals really depend on what that individual student needs, and we use a team internally of clinicians and external panel members, clinicians, neuropsychologists, medical doctors, ophthalmologists, audiologists, whoever needs to be brought into the mix to make an accurate assessment of what the student needs. We're also not test specific. If you get approved for one test, you get approved for all, a one-stop shop, which makes life a little easier for parents. You don't need to reapply if your child has taken the PSAT one year and intends to take the SAT the next. They're approved and will be approved for a year past graduation in high school. So the point being, you make your request, you get the approval, and everything is set for the rest of that time. Any sort of disability that will have an impact on students with on test taking would qualify for accommodations. The real question is, how does it impact that student that day? And here are some of the examples. This is not in any particular order, though certainly learning disabilities and attention deficit issues take up the majority of the requests we get, but we get the full panoply of medical conditions, disabilities, and occasionally a few things that don't fall into any category.
And so, of course, for our community, the first two bullets here typically would be the most common ones that you would see in terms of requests coming in from our community.
And in fact, are the majority of requests that we receive as well. Similarly, the types of accommodations that we give out, as I said, the list is endless. We have a short list of the types of accommodations, and the first two are, in fact, the ones that are most often requested. These are in no particular order thereafter. And we get a new request for an accommodation that we've perhaps never heard of or never analyzed before every week. Assistive technology is changing every day, and there's new software and hardware out there to assist students with a full variety of disabilities. And the only thing that we prevent or prohibit are things that will actually change the construct of the test. And that's not usually a type of accommodation, but more so how that accommodation is used.
And Stephen, do you think you could provide an example of medical management? What does that mean as an accommodation, and also maybe an example of change of setting or placement in setting and how that might help a student?
Certainly. Let's step away from the learning disability ADHD category and think about a student with diabetes who may need to check their blood sugar during a test and then remediate. Do they need insulin? Do they need to eat something? So there's that sort of medical management. We have students who are actively involved in dialysis and other physical medical issues that need remediation because they can't sit for even our shortest tests without addressing their medical issues. Similarly, some medical issues are such that a student can't be tested in the test center or a school. They're hospitalized. They need to be in a home setting or some other variety of settings where it's just inappropriate to test them in a test center or in a local school. But we send the proctors out to wherever it's appropriate to ensure that those students are tested in the appropriate setting.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that the first two, the extended time and breaks, that those are the two most common accommodations that are requested from students who have documented learning disabilities or ADHD? Or maybe you don't have that information?
So absolutely, those are the majority of accommodations requested in general, and certainly from this community.
Thank you.
Now, all right, we have those lists, but what does this break down to? For the College Board and most standardized testing agencies, we're talking about student's disability, what is the student's disability, how that impacts the student, what's going to happen, not simply in their life, because some of the answers to how it impacts the student is obvious. The student has this disability, this is how it impacts them. But how is it going to impact them on test day? When they sit down with that paper or pencil or digital test, how is that medical condition, that disability going to impact them that day? We just spoke about a student with diabetes. Well, we can pretty much understand how it impacts them in terms of their life. How will it impact them on test day? Well, is it sufficiently serious that they're going to need to remediate their blood sugar during the course of the test? And that having been said, what accommodations are appropriate? If a student with diabetes were to ask for a break so that they could test their blood sugar, it's obvious. We don't need to question it any further. We understand what they're doing. If they're asking for a chance to remediate some food, we understand that. A break, perhaps lengthened afterward, just to get back up to speed if their blood sugar had gone too low or too high. Again, very clear. But if a student asks for a scribe, well, now perhaps some explanation is necessary. How do we connect the impact of low or high blood sugar on that particular day to that diabetic, to needing someone to record their answers for them? That doesn't mean that it's inappropriate. It means that we need that explanation. And the documentation we'd hope to see from a requester would explain that connection. The same thing with extra time. Why do you need extra time actually taking the test as opposed to those breaks to take your blood sugar, to have that food, or to take that insulin? How does it really relate, the disability and impact, to that accommodation that's being requested? Now, taking that a step further now, how does that relate to what's going to go on that test day? Because accommodations you're receiving in class may be quite different than what you need on that test day. In a school setting, there are very often broad needs for what you need to get through a school day. There are a variety of different classes taught in different ways. Some are very interactive. There are textbooks, note takers that you may need. You may need to be able to communicate with the teacher in various and different ways, with other students as the communication goes on. There's physical education. There's a very long day ahead of a student. On the other side, we have a standardized test where it's for a limited period of time. Students are sitting with a paper and pencil test or a digital test. And a lot of what a student may need to get through a school day may not be necessary when sitting down to take that test. And sometimes what they're asking, or what you may ask for from your school, may be to cover different types of classes where you use one accommodation for a purpose in social studies, use a different accommodation for the same purpose in math. For a standardized test, you're more likely to need one accommodation to achieve that purpose. So a student may use a note taker in one class, but have a recording device in another class because that's the way the class best works. Mm-hmm. For a standardized test, presumably you'll only need one of those things. And thinking about which one will be most appropriate to ensure that you're demonstrating your ability and not some aspect of the impact due to your disability has to go into the thinking both of parent and student when they're requesting the accommodation, and at our end to help the student get the accommodation they need.
Stephen, I have a question. I know that you can't speak about individual students, but maybe you have either a hypothetical or just a general example in mind of a time when a student with a learning disability or documented learning disability or documented ADHD, they had an IEP or a 504 plan that had a specific accommodation for use in school, but the College Board actually opted with good reason to reject the use of that accommodation on a standardized test.
Oh, certainly. And for a variety of different reasons. We often get requests from parents and students through their schools, which includes basically all the assistive technology, all the accommodations, related aids and services that a student gets in school. That includes duplicate set of textbooks, that gets note takers, that gets copies of other students' notes or copies of the teacher's lesson plans. All things that just don't in any way relate to taking the test. On the other side, there are things that at first blush might indicate a need on a test, but knowing the test just don't apply. Asking for a spell checker or a waiver of spelling and scoring the test might seem appropriate until you know that on College Board tests we don't score on spelling.
Ah, very interesting. I see.
Asking to have instructions repeated before the test or during the test is very commonsensical, very straightforward, makes sense, but every student with or without a disability can ask for instructions to be repeated. So there are things that we deny technically only because you're getting them anyway.
Right, that makes sense.
And really, the other side of it is when students or parents or schools ask for that sort of majority requested accommodation because those are the ones they know about. And sometimes something else is much more appropriate and useful to the student. And looking at the medical documentation, the anecdotal information, the history of the student, we see that, we could give you this accommodation, but doesn't this make more sense to you? One of the things that very different between school life for a student and taking a standardized test is just how those two organizations view the student's time. Very often the school will look at the student's time as all-encompassing of everything they do. So when they give a student double time to take a test or time and a half to take a test, they're incorporating into that time period student needing to go to the restroom more often because they have irritable bowel syndromes, or going to step away from the desk and just move around because they have ADHD and really need to shake off a little of that before sitting down and concentrating again. Very sensible and works in a classroom setting where they're really measuring things based on, a classroom period. On a standardized test, what we're really looking at is how much time do you need actually working on the test, and how much additional time you need to deal with all the other matters that your disability requires you to attend to, whether it's testing for insulin levels in that diabetic student we spoke about, or going to the restroom, or stepping away from the table, the desk, or having a narcoleptic actually go to sleep in the middle of the test. We don't want to give that student extra time. We don't know how long that student's going to be out. We want to make sure that that student gets a full timing for that test, and whatever additional time it takes for them to not only wake up, but get back to where they can focus doesn't impact that clock ticking.
And we have up here the SAT is 3 hours and 45 minutes with 10 separately timed sections. Maybe you can explain the 50% and the 100%, self-pacing.
exactly. 3 hours and 45 minutes, and that's testing time. And then there are a few breaks scheduled within, and there is time before, as anyone who's taken one of these standardized tests know, to fill out the bubble sheet, to get the instructions. It's a long period of time for any student. Now you have 50% extra time. That's 5 hours and 3 minutes of testing time. For double time, 100%, it's over 6 hours. And when you're taking a College Board test, you sit for that entire period of time. You don't move on from section to section. So when you start out on the current SAT with the writing section, if you get done with the test with that section in 10 minutes, you sit till the rest of the students in the room are done, or until the time is done.
And that's what you mean by no self-pacing?
Yes, and then you go on to the next reading section, the next math section. Until the time for that section is done, you sit there. If you're granted 50% extra time, you sit there for 50% longer. 100% twice as long as the normal administration. I've certainly had a number of parents say to us, if I knew that asking for double time meant my child would be sitting there for twice as long, I never would have asked for it. Now, some students need that extra time because it takes them that amount of time to work through the test with the limitations placed upon them by their disability. And certainly those students need it. But other students may need things like breaks, which is often confused with time.
I have a quick question about time, if you don't mind, before we move on. When you do grant 50% extra time or 100% extra time, is that allowed to be self-paced, or it's just never, no self-pacing?
No self-pacing.
So it's just paced differently for you. There's a different set of rules about how that will be paced, that extra time.
It basically means that instead of having a 50-minute section, you have an hour and 40-minute section.
Got it.
And
sorry to interrupt you if you wanted to move on to talk about breaks.
Just think about the impact on the student with chronic pain syndrome, where sitting there is going to be uncomfortable at a regular administration. Now we're doubling that time. A student with ADHD may be fine with lots of extra time sitting there in that controlled setting, or they really are going to be tortured by having to sit there that long without being able to get up, stretch, move around, which is why sometimes extra breaks, which means that after every test section you have a break, extended breaks, longer breaks between each test section, or breaks as needed, where the student calls when they need the break. You can see how important that would be for someone who is testing for blood sugar level, or has irritable bowel syndrome, or is a student with ADHD that needs to get up and move. And the best part of those are it doesn't impinge on their testing time. Clock stops, and the clock is waiting for you when you are able to sit down and continue. A student with epilepsy who has a petit mal seizure doesn't need extra time on the test. They need to have the clock stop until they're ready to proceed. But because schools often measure things in extra periods of time, that's what the student and parent are used to and what they ask for more often. So sometimes there's that intervening step where we actually make sure that that accommodation is useful and appropriate to the student and best serves the student in that kind of situation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, basically at the College Board, and this I know is true at many other test environments, most requests go through the school. In our case, every school in the country, every high school, all 24,000 of them have a designated person who is responsible for representing the school with us, for making sure that accommodation requests are submitted, making sure that they're tracked, making sure that if a student is testing in their school, that they get those accommodations on test day. We refer to them as an SSD coordinator. And they access us through an online system. And 98 to 99% of all requests, that 100,000 requests we were talking about earlier, come through that system every year. The other 1.5% are done through a paper process from parents who may not want to go through the school, either because they don't want to share information with the school or because they disagree with the school about what accommodations are appropriate for their student. And we certainly respect that parents will disagree and that parents of students with disabilities often, unfortunately, have a contentious relationship with their school about ensuring that the appropriate accommodations get to their child. There are also students who don't go to a formalized school or taught at home, and those go through the paper process as well. The SSD online system is interactive with the SSD coordinator at that school and will request all the useful information on the front end, so hopefully making things as simple as possible for the coordinator and for the parents and students providing that information. Everything from name, address, and all that basic information to what's the disability, what's the requested accommodation. How long has the student had a plan in place? And how long has the student been using the accommodation in school? Does the school have all the diagnostic information involved? And is that documentation available?
What's the most common piece of documentation that you'd say parents forget to include? So if you could have a reminder, parents, don't forget to include this, what would you say?
Well, on the opposite side, what parents will often, or schools will often send, is that IEP or Section 504 plan. And if it's an extremely detailed plan with lots of information about the diagnostics, it's a very useful piece of information. But the IEP or 504 plan in any given school is completely different than the one in the school next door, let alone across the country. And a lot of those plans have very little background information. So what we may have is all of that demographic information, name, address, grade, what the disability is, and what the accommodations approved for in school are, without any real sense of why the student needs the accommodations, how it relates to the disability, whether the student's been using them, has the accommodation been effective. What's most useful are the diagnostic and evaluative material that cause the school to either establish or continue that IEP, that Section 504 plan. But in addition to that, the sort of anecdotal information that go along with those evaluations. What did the evaluators see when that student sat down and did those achievement tests, those cognitive tests? What's the teacher seeing in the classroom? Are the accommodations working for the student? Does the student use the accommodation in the classroom? What other information does this parent have at hand? Because we don't want the parent to go to the necessity of getting a new evaluation, of creating a document. But what does this parent have at hand, or do their physicians have at hand, that will tell us about the student and have us understand the student the way they do, and understand that need, if it's not self-evident in the documentation the school is providing us. That's really where we occasionally have to go back to parents and say, explain this to us. We're not seeing it from what you gave us. In the end, approximately 85% of the students requesting accommodations receive them. This isn't a process to prevent people from getting accommodations. It's a process to connect them to appropriate accommodations. And the more information that talks to that point, what does the student need, or what's the impact on the student, and what does the student need to take that College Board test on that given day? The more quickly we can respond, the more effectively we can respond, and hopefully the more appropriately we can respond to getting those accommodations out.
And you have these guidelines for documentation, the 7 guidelines,
Yes.
which I think are very helpful if you want to take a look at
Yes,
this.
and I hope are generally self-evident. Tell us what the disability is. Sometimes we get documentation where we have to guess. Full evaluation was done, but no one's taken that next step. It should be current, and current depends on the disability, on the diagnostics. For cognitive tests, we generally take the first test the student was tested on, so long as it's within best clinical practices. That means cognitive tests generally before the student is in the 3rd grade aren't as useful as the ones after, but we'll look at what the parent has, what the school has. For achievement tests, anything within the last 5 years is generally informative. For other issues that are more volatile, perhaps something within the last year or two, psychiatric conditions, other changing conditions where the impact may be very different from day to day, or certainly year to year. Other disabilities that are more permanent, the initial diagnosis may be the end of everything we need. We certainly don't need a current reiteration that a student is blind, that a student is deaf. But beyond currency, provide that information we were talking about, not simply the numbers, but the history, the observations. Let us know what that student is about. And don't worry about giving us all the other medical documentation that you have. We really don't need to know the child's APGAR scores. We don't need to know what the student was doing in when they were 2 or when they were 4, if they're now 16 and about to sit for an SAT. Tell us what's relevant and explicative to how the student is functioning now. Mm-hmm. How does their disability limit them on the tests they're going to be taking in the relatively near future?
And you mentioned that if a student is, for instance, if they state up front, my child is blind, that typically is enough, and that sometimes you don't have to go much further than that.
Yeah, that initial diagnosis is going to be straightforward.
Right.
Of course, we will still need to know how that student is going to communicate their answers and get the information. Mm-hmm. Is this a student that reads Braille? Is this a student that needs a reader or audio recorded test?
Right. And if a student, say, if the first thing that you see is there's a diagnosis of ADHD, there's a diagnosis of a learning disability, do you have that same reaction, or is there something, or are you saying, okay, good to know, now I need to know this other information, and what is usually the next piece that is the most helpful for you in determining accommodations for those kids?
Yeah, I think that, I hope your participants agree that there's a wide range of effects and limitations to a student who may have a learning disability. There are lots of different impacts of learning disabilities, whether it's an ability to work with the written word or to convey it back. There are issues involving memory as opposed to reading, as opposed to retention, as opposed to executive functioning. And how is this individual student being impacted? Same thing with ADHD. One student may be fine in a controlled setting. Another student may need to be in a smaller group with less distraction. Another student may need to get up and bounce off the walls a little or move around. how does that individual student experience their disability? How does it limit them, and how will the limitation impact them on the day they take the test, when they're taking a test? So that we know that we get the accommodation that's most appropriate for them, so that they can demonstrate their abilities and their knowledge effectively. And that's what it's about. And that's also one of the differences between taking a standardized test and a lot of the things they do in school, where a lot of the learning goals and things are created to try and get the best out of the student. If the student scores better, demonstrates better, that they've mastered a particular topic, a piece of information, a new skill, that's showing that the learning goals and the teaching methodology is working better. With an accommodation, a better score isn't the best gauge as to whether the accommodation is effective. It's really, is the accommodation addressing the limitation? Because, quite simply, everyone who gets extra time will probably do a little better. A student who is time impacted because of their disability will probably exceed that. But again, we could all use a little extra time in our lives. So we do look to that individual student, and we hope that when we need to look at documentation, that's the sort of thing we're going to see. Now, we do rely upon the information from schools. If a school is telling us that a student with a learning disability, with ADHD, has a formal plan in place for a reasonable amount of time, have been receiving these accommodations for a reasonable amount of time in class, on tests, and that all the documentation in the school's hands by appropriate people. We don't have people diagnosing a particular disability who aren't certified to do so. We don't have podiatrists determining whether a student has ADHD, for example. But the appropriate clinical people are making those evaluations, and the documentation is in the school's hands. We will generally accede to that school's recommendation. Approximately 60% of the requests we get, we allow the school to validate those determinations for us, and we may not take an extensive look at that information. But for a student who is newly diagnosed, or for some reason has never used the accommodation in school, or for which the school just doesn't have any background information, the school took the parent's word that the student needed that, or took a prescription pad note from the student's doctor as sufficient evidence. We'd like to see a little more. We'd like to really understand what the student needs so we can make sure that the appropriate accommodation is available. And in those kinds of situations, we're looking for that evaluation if an evaluation was done. With full information, actual scores, not just equivalence. There are a few tests out there that we'd like additional tests because in and of themselves, they don't tell us enough. But they're fine with other tests. And certainly we're not here specifying a test. We're not recommending go out and get that test done. There are lots of good cognitive tests out there. There are lots of good achievement tests out there. There are lots of good rating scales and other tests used to diagnose ADHD and attentional issues. We will work with what the parent and the school and the student have.
Stephen, I'm wondering if we can go through the strategies for supporting students just to make sure that we have enough time to get to questions from our audience. Because I think you've got some great strategies here.
Yeah, and the basic one in red, Start early. Your child may not be taking a standardized test till their junior year or their senior year of school. But why send in the request immediately before the test? It takes College Board clinicians an average of 7 weeks to go through all the material. Not because it takes 7 weeks to read everything you've sent us, though some of the submissions are thick, but because there are 100,000 requests coming in. And on any given month, we may receive 5,000 to 10,000 requests. So, but why send it in just 7 weeks before the test administration? Why take the chance that there's that one piece of information that we don't have that would allow us to understand your child, your student, and we didn't receive it and are only getting back to you so close to test day that we won't have another opportunity to review that documentation. Instead, let's start freshman year. Parents, students, the school are going to meet and set up an IEP meeting, a 504 meeting. Why not talk about having that school person get online and submit the request then, so that if you're going to take the PSAT in a student's sophomore year or their junior year, they'll already have been approved, and there'll be no concerns about will this child have the accommodation on test day. Occasionally it takes 2 or 3 back and forth to get the information that's necessary. Sometimes the school just sends us 1 page to start with that says, we'd like this student to get this accommodation. We need to go back to them. Sometimes the second time is just that 504 plan that doesn't give us any more contextual information, deep information about what we're doing. So again, we need to go back. Let's have us do that at the front end.
So start early.
Start early. And think about what that student needs on test day so that we don't get caught discussing accommodations that aren't going to be useful. Don't ask or have the school ask for everything on that 504 plan, or ask for things that you can't possibly use when taking that test. Assist the school to understand that, the student to understand that, so that they know what's going to happen on test day. There's lots of information on our websites so that you can understand what the test looks like. There are practice exams, so that there's no reason that you can't anticipate what the student will need, especially if you're taking a practice exam and you've seen the student work through a standardized test. And the last thing is to encourage students to advocate for themselves, not simply because it's a wonderful thing to learn in their high school years, but as they move on to post-secondary education in college, they're going to have to. It's one of the big differences between elementary and secondary school and the post-secondary setting is that there is that expectation that a student will advocate for themselves. Here, transitioning between the two, whether you're taking an SAT or an AP exam, is an opportunity for that student to be involved in the process as well.
And this next slide here, thank you so much, Stephen. This next slide here, we have some information about getting in contact with the College Board, which we're gonna leave up for while I'm talking for a minute or two here, just so that if anyone's watching, you can jot down this information. But keep in mind that we also archive all of these webinars, so you will be able to access this information on our website after this webinar. But just so, thank you so much, Stephen, for going through that presentation with us. The next thing we're going to do is go to our users on Ustream. I just want to remind everyone that if you want to submit a question for Stephen to answer, you can do so on the right side of your screen on Ustream in that chat box, or you can tweet at us at understood.org. So that's understood.org, at understood.org. So we'll receive questions that way as well. So, and also just a reminder that, Stephen obviously isn't going to know what your individual children's needs are, so he'll be speaking generally. So to provide as much detail as possible, but also to keep in mind that he is unable to to say whether or not your child will receive accommodations. So I'm going to, Stephen, I'm going to start with our first question here from the audience. And so this is a question, and again, this user, Nola Berngal, I think I'm saying that right. It's a question about an individual student. However, you can speak about it in general terms, of course. Her child is homeschooled and has a dyslexia diagnosis. So the question is it possible for her child to have accommodations on the test?
Absolutely. Because the child is homeschooled, or a child is homeschooled, and I'm going to distinguish between students who have been placed in their homes by their school district because that's appropriate for providing a free, appropriate public education. But parents who choose to educate their children at home certainly can have accommodations on the test. They need to send in a paper request for accommodations. It's you need the actual form, not a photocopy. You can contact the College Board, call the general numbers, and they'll send one out to you immediately. Fill it out like any bubble sheet with pencil and send it in to us with documentation to support the request, the documentation we've been talking about today. And it will be reviewed, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible.
Great, thank you. We also had a question from an anonymous user coming up, and I'm going to ask that we show the slide of how to contact the College Board really quickly, because the question was, is there a helpline that the College Board has for questions? And Stephen, should I assume that it's the coordinator hotline, or what's the best number to reach if you have general questions for the College Board? This looks like it's the coordinator hotline or SAT general question. Well, actually, no, you have it divided up here very specifically, so this user can take a look at this list.
There are a number of phone numbers there. There are also other College Board numbers that are specifically designated for students with disabilities. We have trained customer service people out there who can answer basic questions. And if it becomes more complex, the question will be elevated to people with more extensive knowledge. So we can work you through the process. If you've had a determination and want to discuss it, we have people willing to discuss that. And really ensure that you understand whatever feedback we've given you. If we've asked for more information, understand what we're looking for and why, so that we can make sure that your next submission is hopefully your last submission, and we will understand what the student needs.
Great, thank you. And again, just a reminder that we will be archiving this webinar so you can have access to this information after today's event. Another question from an anonymous user is, how are read aloud items handled on the SAT? And that's the only information provided in this question. Stephen, is that enough for you to provide an answer, maybe a general answer?
Well, there are some questions on some tests that are oral, such as foreign language exams, in which case, if the disability prevents a student from comprehending that, whether a student has a hearing disability or some other processing issue, then either we provide the test question in another format, perhaps in writing, depending on what the purpose is of asking the question, what we're seeking to measure. Or in some rare cases, that question will be not scored for that student. If we're truly unable to give it in another format. But that's very rare. For students who need the entire test read aloud because they can't interact with the written word, there are a variety of ways. We have readers, we have recorded tests, and the same information is given for items that are diagrams. There is a reader script, so that the diagram, the picture, the chart will have sufficient information for a person to understand without being able to read along with that information or to see perhaps the diagram. For Braille users or for individuals who need it, there are also raised line diagrams, so you can actually feel the text of a diagram or a chart.
Great, thank you. So we have another question coming in from another anonymous user. This question is about applying for accommodations on the PSAT. So the user asks, for the PSAT in sophomore year, when during the freshman year should the school submit a request for accommodations? I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I won't steal your thunder.
Well, aside from saying early.
Exactly.
In most cases, a student with a disability, the parent of a student with a disability, will sit down with the school once a year to set up a new plan for the forthcoming year, whether it's at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year for the following year. We don't want a student or parent to go through extra hoops to request an accommodation. Why not use that meeting to discuss and encourage the school to make that request? And so do it freshman year. And whether a student is going to be taking the PSAT sophomore year, junior year, or any other test, the SAT subject tests, a student may be taking one in their freshman year. Make sure that you've given yourself enough time to get that request in. So early is always good.
Start early, everybody. Start as early as you possibly can. This will be our last question, Stephen. So we have another anonymous user who asks, if my child receives accommodations for his 504 plan, will that be considered for the College Board? And as you know, a lot of parents in our audience, they have kids who have IEPs or 504 plans. So this is definitely a very relevant question.
Absolutely, yeah. And whether it's an IEP, a 504 plan, some sort of written plan at a private school, we consider all of them. A 504 plan is certainly as valid as an IEP or a private school plan for purposes of indicating what a student is getting in school. Questions are, how long has the student had a plan? Is the student using the accommodations in the plan? Are the diagnostic information, the evaluative material being held by the school? In some cases, cannot be shared with us. But certainly a 504 plan is no different than any other sort of formal plan with that respect.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. This has been extremely helpful. And again, just a reminder to everyone that we will be archiving this webinar. And I also like to give a little plug for our next chat, which is tomorrow's Weekend Wisdom Chat, where you can ask Understood anything. Anything. I mean, related to learning and attention issues, but anything, I guess, if that's the route you want to go. So, Stephen, thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And to all of our audience members, thank you so much for participating. We love having you here, and we hope to see you at our next webinar in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.